You're listening to the Sex and Psychology Podcast, the sex ed you never got in school and won't get anywhere else. I am your host, Dr. Justin Lehmiller. I am a social psychologist and research fellow at the Kinsey Institute and author of the book, Tell Me What You Want, The Science of Sexual Desire and How It Can Help You Improve Your Sex Life. Most of us think we have a pretty good sense of what we're looking for in a partner. We talk about having a type. We build mental checklists of the traits that we want in a relationship, and we often assume that if we could just find someone who checks enough of those boxes, everything else will just fall into place naturally. But decades of psychological research suggest that attraction and compatibility don't actually work that way. In fact, people are often surprisingly bad at predicting who they'll be drawn to and who they'll ultimately connect with. So what really determines romantic compatibility? In this episode, we're going to explore what science reveals about how attraction actually unfolds, why chemistry is so hard to predict, and what we should really be paying attention to when evaluating a potential partner. My guest is Dr. Paul Eastwick, a professor of psychology at UC Davis, where he serves as the head of the Social Personality Psychology program and the director of the Attraction and Relationships Research Laboratory. He hosts the popular podcast Love Factually with his longtime colleague Eli Finkel, where they analyze rom-coms and romantic dramas from the perspective of relationship science. Paul is also the author of the new book, Bonded by Evolution. Hi, Paul, and welcome back to the show.
Hi, Justin. Thanks so much for having me back.
Well, it's always wonderful to have you here, and congratulations on the new book.
Thank you. It's been a wild ride. I've enjoyed this part of it.
Well, I'm very excited to have a chance to dive into it with you in this episode and the next one. So in today's show, we're talking all about romantic compatibility and how we determine it. Now, you've done some really influential work in this area, showing that people's stated preferences don't strongly predict who they actually fall for in real life. And that's deeply counterintuitive, right? You might be tempted to think that what we think we want in somebody else is what we actually want, but maybe it isn't. So let's start there. Why are we so convinced that we know our quote unquote type? And what does the data actually show?
Yeah, I mean, look, people have very clear answers when you ask them about their deal breakers, you ask them about the kinds of qualities they're looking for in a partner. People are at no shortage of answers for questions like these. But what you say you're interested in, the kinds of traits that you might rate highly on scales, or the kinds of traits you might list off as, being the things that you're looking for first and foremost when you're evaluating somebody, those are not necessarily the things that appeal to us in the moment. Now, for a long time, the research in this space just looked at the first thing. It looked at, what are the attributes that people say they want? Are there gender differences in the kind of attributes that people say they want in a partner? But when we entered this space about 15 to 20 years ago, we wanted to try to get at a different question, which is when you're meeting people face to face, you're trying to figure out if you'd like to have a relationship with somebody, what are the traits that inspire your romantic interest? The traits that make you more interested in this person rather than that person? And when you approach people's revealed preferences this way, try to understand what are the traits that people actually want in a partner, you sometimes get a different story.
So how do we know what are the traits that we just think we want versus the things that we actually do want? Like, how do you elicit that? Like, how do you figure out these are the traits that really matter to someone versus maybe these are just traits that somebody thinks they should want in a partner, maybe because they've been culturally conditioned to think that that's what they're supposed to want, or that that's the socially desirable thing to say that they should want?
And so I'll walk us through right now one of the ways that we can explore this research question. You can test this in a variety of different contexts. You can look at long-term relationships or relationships that are just forming in the first place. But let me describe how we do this in speed dating, because I think it's the most intuitive form of this kind of test. So when we ran speed dating events about 15, 20 years ago with some Northwestern undergraduates, we did a couple of things. First, before the event, we would ask them, what are the traits that you really want a romantic partner to have? What are the traits that are really going to appeal to you when you go speed dating? And people might give high ratings to things like funny, or they might give high ratings to things like confident. So let's use confident as an example. Some people are going to rate that trait quite highly, and others won't rate it quite as highly. And so we would say that, okay, there's a difference in people's stated preference for confidence. But now you're going to go to this speed dating event. So I'll use an example of a heterosexual speed dating event. We ran mostly heterosexual events. And so at these events, you'd have all of the men meeting all of the women for a few minutes each. And let's say, for the sake of argument, that some of these women are high in confidence and some are low in confidence. So for somebody who said, hey, I really care about confidence in a partner, what we should see is that at the speed dating event, they are especially drawn to the confident rather than the less confident partners. But when you run the numbers, you crunch the stats, what you find is that these are just two independent things. How much you said you cared about confidence before the event, it's just not going to be related one way or the other to the extent to which confidence actually appealed to you in the partners that you met while speed dating. And so I think that example really illustrates this divide between what people say they want and what they actually want.
Does this mean that we don't really have a quote unquote type then? Or does it just mean that what we think of as a type is just like some idealized image that we have in our heads that doesn't necessarily have a lot of bearing on who we go for in real life?
Yeah, I think the type question is fascinating because it certainly seems like, we are drawn to certain types of people. Where I think some of this idea comes from actually is illustrated by another way that we tried to get at this question. What we did in this study is we actually looked at people's exes. This is quite hard to do. Studies like this. Most people don't want to nominate their exes to participate in a study about them and don't participate in studies long enough for people to get a handle on your multiple exes. But there are a few data sets out there that have this sort of data. And so what I could do is I could look at all of your exes, Justin, and see what they had in common. And there would be things that they have in common. Maybe they're similarly intelligent or similarly affluent or similarly, religious or not religious. And so, just taken at face value, that seems like you have a type, right? You date people with similar qualities along these lines. And these are qualities that people care about. But we also looked at one other thing, which is, what was your general social environment like? That is, could you have been meeting people who had different levels of intelligence or income, et cetera, et cetera? And it turned out that most of the similarity among people's exes, it was due to where people lived. Yep. It was due to who they were meeting in the first place. Within that milieu, they seem to kind of be picking randomly. So I do think there's some truth to the idea that people have a type, but it's like not coming from within. It's sort of being imposed on us by the people that we're surrounded by.
Right. And I think that's really interesting. And it reminds me of another study, and maybe this was actually your study, where it also looked at this in relation to personality types, right? And it found that for people who are more introverted, they tended to have more commonality in the partners that they had, past and present, versus people who are more extroverted had more variety. And I think that makes total sense because extroverts get out there and they meet a wider range of people. And so there might be less similarity between the types of people that they end up starting relationships with versus maybe somebody who's a bit more introverted plays in a smaller circle. And so there's a smaller field of eligibles for them.
Yeah, I love that interpretation. And I think that's probably spot on. And when people look for advice, like, I'm meeting these losers, what do I do? I really do think it's about shaping your pool in that way. Like sometimes people think they're making a series of bad choices and who they're dating, but there's something to be said for exerting the control over who you're dating upstream. Like, let's try to shape it by shaping what your pool is in the first place, rather than imposing some sort of limitation on yourself. Oh, if I'm not blown away by date 2 or something like that, then I should bail. I think there really is something to be said for those upstream approaches.
Yeah, definitely. So something people often say is, well, this person was perfect on paper. Like they checked all the boxes, their profile photos and all that stuff looked good. But then we met in person and there was no spark, right? So in other words, they just didn't feel any chemistry or connection. And I think that's where a lot of the disconnect comes in terms of how a lot of us and a lot of dating apps are approaching things. We're just looking for someone who checks a certain minimum number of boxes, but it turns out that that's far from a guarantee of real chemistry when two people actually meet. So I wondered if you could explain this for us. Why is it so hard to predict in advance whether any two given people are going to have a spark together?
Yeah. So this is kind of the vanguard of the research right now, where we're trying to figure out, all right, why exactly is this so hard? Why is it that people don't seem to be using their own particular idiosyncratic preferences once they meet potential partners in person? Because it's worth noting, I think people probably are drawing from their preferences when they're swiping on the apps. So when you're looking at folks and you've got a profile in front of you, it's pretty easy to compare those stats against what you'd want in an ideal partner.
Mm-hmm.
And people do make decisions that way. So it's like you're shaping this pool to ideally kind of fit what you're going to be looking for. But again, given the research we've seen to date, it seems like you're probably doing nothing more than flipping a coin in terms of how you're ultimately going to feel about that person. So why is this? One possibility is that there's just too many traits. I mean, there's just too many things to focus on. And so, confidence sounds good, and so does adventurousness, but so does intelligence, and so does warmth, and you could go on and on and on. And your opinion about all those attributes, those are real opinions that you have. But ultimately, a person is going to be a mixed bag of good things and middling things and just okay things. And the good things shape how you feel about the middling things and so on and so forth. Like, people are complicated in this way. Now, that inspires the thought, well, okay, so you're right. It could be a million things. What if I just focus on like 3 biggies? What if I just instead try to pick out the key things that somebody really has to have? We've done studies like this too, where we stop giving people the lists of traits and we just say, okay, you tell me what are the attributes that a romantic partner has to have, and you will like that person more if you meet them, if they do have those 3 must-have attributes. So that seems good, but the kicker is that if I'd use somebody else's must-haves, somebody else's deal breakers, somebody who's not you, with my deal breakers, if I impose them on you, well, you would have liked that person just as much. And so I think the fundamental problem is that real people, as they present to us, as they feel to us in person, it's just a very different exercise, right? Trying to get a sense of like, oh, like that's impressive about you, or here's how you make me feel about me, like a confident person, like confidence in a partner. There are some confident people who make me feel confident. There are some confident people who make me feel small, right? Why is it like that in one case, but not the other case? These things are fundamentally kind of unpredictable. And I think these sorts of experiments are starting to get at why it's so hard for people to predict ahead of time what's ultimately going to appeal to them.
This also has me thinking about just how when you meet somebody actually in person, that's a very dynamic interaction. It's very different from looking at a static profile, right? And there's at least 2 other things that matter there. One is how we show up in that particular situation. Like if you were stressed and had a terrible day, you're in a bad mood, or your phone is blowing up, you might not really be even open to kind of feeling chemistry because you're just not really that present and in the moment. But then there's also, well, what is the other person kind of bringing to the table and how are they making you feel? What is it that they're saying? And, if they say the quote unquote wrong thing, as you were sort of mentioning with confidence, being something that can make you feel big or can make you feel small, right? Depending upon what they say, if they put their foot in their mouth and so forth, that can totally change the dynamic of that interaction. And so there's a lot of complex variables that I think are hard for something like, say, an algorithm to predict in advance, because you don't know what the state of each person is going to be when they actually enter that in-person interaction. And so, like you said, people are complicated, but also the interaction itself has all of these uncontrolled variables that I think are just super hard to predict or say in advance. What if the everyday things you rely on were built with intention? I've been thinking lately about how even the small details in our daily routines shape how we feel, especially when it comes to rest. Because how you sleep affects everything: your mood, your focus, your patience, and your relationships. This is one of the reasons I love Cozy Earth. Their products are crafted with incredible attention to detail, from their ultra-soft, temperature-regulating comforters that offer a cloud-like feel with just the right amount of support, to their essential socks that are breathable, cushioned, and just feel great from the moment you slip them on. I never realized how much these things matter until I experienced the difference. Having a comforter that has just the right amount of weight but doesn't get too hot makes all the difference for quality sleep. And the socks? They're one of those small upgrades that just make everyday life more luxurious. Cozy Earth offers a 100-night sleep trial and a 10-year warranty, so you can feel the quality for yourself. Returns are easy, but after experiencing this level of comfort, you're not going to want to send it back. Discover how care in every detail transforms simple routines into moments of true comfort and ease. Head to CozyEarth.com and use my code Justin for up to 20% off. And if you get a post-purchase survey, make sure to mention that you heard about Cozy Earth right here. Experience the craft behind the comfort and make every day feel intentional.
I think this is spot on. When we think about conversations, what it's like when you're first getting to know somebody. I mean, especially if we think about like a typical date. So I got 20 minutes to give you my life story. We imagine something that is very straightforward and simple. I'm about to present you some stats, some facts and figures about myself, and hopefully those things impress you. People should not date like this. And often people don't. Often people do something better, which is you have an actual conversation with somebody. But conversations are chaotic. Mm-hmm. You don't quite know where these conversations are going to go. So when we watch our speed daters, I think sometimes people think like, well, that must have been so sexy. All these people in this room chatting each other up. It's not sexy at all.
Nope.
In fact, it's like pretty painful as people go through this process of finding something to talk about. So maybe, again, these were undergraduates, so maybe they'd start by like kind of weaving their way over to talk about their majors, and maybe the majors are similar, or maybe they're not, and can they ask some good questions about that? Or maybe they bail on that and they talk about where they're from originally, or where they're living on campus, or hopefully they know somebody in common, or they comment on how weird the whole experience is. I mean, there are all of these different pathways that they can take. And the reasons that some pairs hit on a little bit of gold in there, maybe they do know somebody in common. It doesn't make you compatible that you both know Joey, but it's a much more pleasant initial conversation. You're going to walk away from that thinking that, oh, maybe I should, chat with that person again. That was fun. That's where so much of this sense comes from. So, in some ways, the best interventions, if I want to put you in a situation where you're more likely to like somebody right away, it's not about your traits and their traits. I should give you some like conversational tips and tricks. I should give you some methods of finding things to connect over, even though it doesn't really matter what the thing is, right? I mean, it can be foreign cinema or it could be Joey.
So, this has me thinking about how some people are going to interpret this research through a very pessimistic lens to be like, well, so compatibility is just totally random or you just get lucky. What do you say to that? Like, are there things that are sort of in our control here when it comes to finding a compatible partner, or is it just totally due to random chance?
I acknowledge that the randomness inherent in this process can feel daunting, but it's only random in a sense that it doesn't mean that it's immune to various structural things that we could try to do for people's initial conversations. I mean, I am a big fan of the Art Aaron 36 questions test, also called the Fast Friends procedure. I mean, is there a more tried and true thing in relationship science for getting two people to connect during a first interaction? I don't think there is. The effect of this manipulation is quite powerful. So for people who aren't familiar with it, the general idea is that you work through this set of 36 questions. You don't have to do all 36. They sort of move in stages from questions that are, sort of middling in terms of the amount of vulnerability that they'll elicit. Like, oh, if you had a crystal ball, what would be one thing you'd want to know? I mean, that's a little better than where did you grow up? But it really gets to some pretty deep stuff, like, what's one thing you wish you'd told somebody and why haven't you told them yet? If you get two strangers talking about these things, you would be surprised at the connections that can form. It doesn't mean that it's going to work with everybody by a long shot. There's still so much that we don't understand about why, even if we're talking about deep things, why, I really have a thing for this person, but not these 8 other people. But I think these approaches, putting ourselves in positions where we have a chance to open up, preferably in situations where we get to interact with people multiple times. So if you have one good conversation, you put yourself in a position to have a second good conversation with that person and sort of build from there. I think that's the way to think about this, rather than I got to strike gold from the moment we sit down. I think that's the lens for looking at this problem that's ultimately demoralizing.
Yeah. And, that actually feeds very nicely into my next question, which was whether compatibility is something that we discover or if it's something that we build. I think that's probably a more optimistic way of thinking about it, is that maybe chemistry compatibility isn't something that's just like instantaneous. It's going to hit you in the moment and you're automatically going to know it, but it has to be something where you're approaching it with more of a growth mindset, right? That this is something that you can cultivate with a potentially large number of people, like that you don't necessarily need to find your one soulmate, that needle in a haystack, but rather maybe there's a lot of people out there that you could be compatible with if you just approached it with the right mindset and with this idea that compatibility is something that you grow rather than you just like instantly automatically know from, like, say, looking at a profile photo or something like that.
Yeah, I really think this is where everything seems to be pointing these days, that compatibility is largely something that's grown over time, that relationships are relationships because they have a history to them, that they are things that people have constructed piece by piece, often not knowing where these things are going. I think there's a lot of evidence consistent with this idea. First and foremost, this is something that I always feel compelled to point out whenever you get me talking, but it's that, look, even in today's day and age, a large portion of relationships form from friendships and other casual acquaintances, as opposed to a lightning strike at moment one. Mm-hmm. We have sets of relationships where we've tried to track the trajectory of these relationships from the moment that these people met each other in the first place. What you see is that, look, the lightning strike folks are in there. I don't know, it's maybe like 20% of, these are all pairings that will go on to be real relationships. So of that class of relationships, like 20%, they felt it from the first moment. But like 40% are at rock bottom. 40%, I thought nothing of you the first time we met. But I had the luxury of interacting with you over and over again over time. We had a few good interactions. We scaffolded up to additional good interactions. We found the things that we either have in common or enjoy doing together, and we construct the relationship around that. I think this is a very useful way of thinking about how people find compatibility and how they generate it. That it's like through this repeated testing and retesting process, you kind of find what works and then you try to repeat it and add a little something more. So I think this is far closer to an explanation of why we're compatible with some people and not others, rather than thinking about like, oh, I'm going to know right away whether we're a fit or not.
Yeah. This also has me thinking too about how there are just differences in the way that people experience love, right? Love isn't the same for everyone. And for some people, love grows and emerges from this place of feeling safe and secure with somebody else first. And maybe they're not going to feel sexual passion or desire or chemistry until they've got that, kind of attachment bond to someone else, which I think is why the friends first relationships are so common and why they work for a lot of people, is because they're activating that attachment system first before turning into, something that has more of that, what we think of as being romantic chemistry. Whereas for other people, it's that spontaneous, totally out of the blue kind of thing. And it starts with passionate love and then gradually simmers down over time into something that's a deeper attachment. But yeah, there's inherent individual variability here in how we just approach and experience something like love.
Yeah, the internet appears to think that there's one way to do it. And that way is be the best, be very impressive, be at the top of the hierarchy. When people meet you, they will fall for you. They will all want to be with you. And that's how you do it. That's how you mate as a human. And I couldn't disagree with that take any more strongly. Yes, I acknowledge that people can do it this way, but there are other ways to do it. And for many of us, those ways will be better, more fulfilling, and ultimately more successful. And it's exactly what you're describing. Getting to know people over time, it actually means that you place more emphasis on the importance of compatibility, because compatibility, the portion of attraction that is due to compatibility, grows as people spend more time together. That means, okay, we've been hanging out for a while and we all agreed that, this person was a 6 when they first joined our group. But now some people think they're a 3 and some people think that they're a 9. Okay. So when you have more compatibility, it opens up more possibilities for, two people to find each other who think each other are a 9 or a 10. For a lot of people, that sort of social network relationship formation gradually kind of approach. I didn't think much of you at first, but then we found things to connect over. I felt more attachment to you and the passion came from there. This is a better approach for many of us. And I think the apps make us forget about this route.
Yeah, that's a classic finding in social psychology where people are actually more attracted to someone who initially didn't like them at first, but later came around and did like them. Right? So this idea that you won somebody over kind of makes them more appealing, that you changed their mind. It's kind of a weird thing.
Yeah, it's also kind of thrilling too, to just have this sense that when you see yourself growing on somebody else, right? You see them being more interested in you than they were the prior time. It's all very exciting. And again, because we don't hang out in groups in the same way that we used to, we don't get to experience that phenomenon as much.
Yeah. Well, this has been an amazing conversation, Paul. I'm really looking forward to continuing it in the next episode and talking all about how to make online dating work for you, or how to make online dating suck a little less.
Yeah. Can't wait.
Can you please tell my listeners where they can go to learn more about you and your work and get a copy of your new book, Bonded by Evolution?
Yes, you can get the book, Bonded by Evolution, wherever books are sold. And if you want to hear me talk about rom-coms and romantic films with Eli Finkel, you can check out the Love Factually podcast, which Justin has been a guest on in the past on our Easy A episode. But check out that podcast to hear us talk about movies.
Great. And I'll be sure to include links to all of that in the show notes. Thank you again so much for your time. I really appreciate having you here.
Thanks so much, Justin.
Thank you for listening. To keep up with new episodes of this podcast, visit my website, Sex and Psychology, at sexandpsychology.com, or subscribe on your favorite platform, where I hope you'll take a moment to rate and review the show. If you listen on Apple Podcasts, please consider becoming a Sex and Psychology Premium subscriber to enjoy ad-free listening for just $3.99 a month. You can also follow me on social media for daily sex research updates. I'm on Blue Sky and X at Justin Lehmiller and Instagram at Justin J. Lehmiller. Also, be sure to check out my book, Tell Me What You Want. Thanks again for listening. Until next time.